This video contains a fictional story created exclusively for entertainment and inspiration. This content is not intended for educational purposes. The narrative is original and was developed by a human creator with the support of artificial intelligence tools and creative review. No real events or historical facts are being presented as true. Bath, in late October, did not so much announce itself as it arranged itself, stone upon stone, light upon light, manners upon manners, until a person felt compelled to stand a little straighter, simply by walking its streets. The city had a way of making even ordinary footsteps sound measured, as if the cobbles remembered the tread of titled families and expected the present to behave accordingly. That week, the air carried the faint mineral tang of the springs, a clean sharpness that rose whenever the mist thinned and the sun returned to its work. By late afternoon, when the clouds opened like a reluctant curtain, the honeyed limestone of the crescents warmed to gold, and the windows caught the light in orderly rows, each pane reflecting the sky as though it, too, had been trained. It was into that trained beauty, into that careful world, where Everard Jasper Ravenshollow arrived, with the stubborn composure of a man who refused to be impressed by anything he could not count. He came with duty in one hand, and arithmetic in the other. The Duke of Ravenshollow was 34, and if the number carried any shame, it was not the kind that showed on his face. He had the sort of features that did not beg for admiration. A strong nose, a mouth made for restraint, eyes a quiet, penetrating gray-blue that did not move quickly unless something had earned the motion. His hair, dark and neatly kept, was already touched with the faintest sign of early silver at the temples. It did not make him older so much as it made him look as though he had been thinking for a long time. He had. Everard had been managing Ravenshollow since his father's death 8 years earlier. 8 years of tenants and ledgers, of correspondence that arrived with complaint wrapped in politeness, of roofs that needed mending and fields that needed draining, of the slow realization that old titles did not protect a man from modern problems. The estate was not failing, it was sound. But soundness required vigilance, and vigilance required a particular kind of mind, one that preferred clear outcomes to hopeful intentions. Marriage, his family assured him, was a clear outcome. By the time his carriage crossed Pulteney Bridge and turned into streets where Georgian facades stood in calm symmetry, he had already endured a dozen variations of the same argument. A duke must wed, a line must continue, alliances must be strengthened, fortunes must be secured. The words changed, but the weight did not. His aunt in London had written with elegant sharpness. His solicitor had coughed meaningfully at the end of meetings, as if the absence of an heir were an undignified draft in an otherwise respectable room. Even the staff at Ravenshollow, people who would have died before presuming to advise him directly, had begun to look at him with a particular carefulness, as though they were all quietly holding their breath over the future. Everard did not resent them. He merely resented the assumption that a life could be arranged like furniture. This chair here, this table there, this woman in the place that must be filled. Bath was meant to make it easier. Bath was where families brought eligible daughters to be seen and evaluated with enough elegance that the evaluation could pretend to be romance. It was where a man might discover a suitable wife in the same way he might discover a good horse, by observing the creature's temperament, its soundness, the steadiness of its gait. It was not a cruel comparison. It was merely the sort of comparison Everard's mind made when it was trying not to make any other. His rented townhouse on Brock Street was comfortable in that impersonal way such places often were. Good carpets, polished banisters, a sitting room that smelled faintly of beeswax and coal smoke. His secretary, Mr. Aldous Pennington, had already seen to the fires and the letters and the schedule. A tray of tea sat ready, steam rising like a quiet suggestion. On the hall table, laid with meticulous intent, was an invitation card edged in gold. The Pemberton Assembly that evening, music and dancing, supper at midnight. Everard looked at the card as he removed his gloves. The paper was thick, the ink precise. "It begins," he said, though no one had asked him a question. Pennington, who had the priceless talent of hearing remarks without turning them into conversation, simply replied, "Yes, Your Grace. Shall I have your evening coat prepared?" Everard inclined his head, already moving toward the stairs. His boot struck the steps with that particular controlled sound of a man who disliked announcing himself even in his own home. Upstairs, he washed the road from his hands, changed with practiced speed, and allowed himself 10 full minutes to stand by the window before leaving. Outside, Bath was sinking into evening. The sky in the west still held a thin band of pale orange, but the rest had darkened to a deep blue gray. Gas lamps were being lit one by one, each flame a small sphere of order in the spreading dusk. Somewhere down the street, a carriage wheel hit a pothole with a hollow thud, followed by a driver's low murmur to his horses. Everard watched it all as though the city were a painting, and he were trying to determine whether the artist had been honest. At 8:30, his carriage brought him to the assembly rooms. He could hear the string quartet before he entered. Violins tuned not merely to pitch, but to expectation. The music drifting out through the open doors with the scent of candle wax and perfume. Inside, the room was warm, bright, alive with polite movement. 100 small conversations ran together into a single sound. Laughter contained to the proper volume, greetings offered with practiced delight, the soft rustle of silk and the whisper of gloves. Everard stepped into it with the calm of a man entering a committee meeting. He was greeted by Lord Pemberton himself, pink-faced, genial, pleased with his own success as host. Introductions were made, hands shaken, compliments exchanged. Everard's title moved through the room like a current. He felt it in the subtle turn of faces, the slight shift of bodies making room. He did not enjoy the sensation, but he had long ago learned to bear it as one bears weather. A glass of champagne was pressed into his hand. He did not drink it. He held it because holding it prevented other people from pressing other things on him. Conversation, expectations, assumptions disguised as charm. He positioned himself near the edge of the room, where a man could observe without seeming to. It was not a trick. It was self-preservation. From the margins, you could see what the center tried to hide. He let his gaze move calmly across the crowd. Mothers with the eager tension of merchants at market. Daughters with bright smiles that did not reach the eyes. Young men in search of fortune dressed as flirtation. There were exceptions. There were always exceptions. But a season like this brought out the same patterns in nearly everyone. Even the room seemed to participate. Mirrors reflecting the dancers, as if to multiply the spectacle. Chandeliers hanging above like clustered stars, indifferent and glittering. And then, near the tall windows at the far end, he saw her. She was not posed. She was not hunting. She was not even at that moment being noticed by anyone important enough to make other people notice her. She stood slightly apart, in conversation with an older woman who leaned on a cane with the dignity of someone who would rather die than appear frail. The young lady listened with the stillness of genuine attention. Her head was angled just so, her brows softened, her mouth relaxed into a faint, thoughtful curve. Everard, who had witnessed 1,000 versions of polite listening, recognized the difference at once. Most young women in rooms like this listened the way one holds a tray. Carefully, with an eye toward not dropping anything, always waiting for the moment they could set it down. This young woman listened the way one listens to a story that matters, as if the older woman's words had weight. It was a small thing, small enough that he could have dismissed it. He did not. He found himself watching longer than was prudent. Candlelight pooled across her shoulders, turning the fabric of her gown, simple, pale, without excessive ornament, into something softly luminous. She wore a narrow ribbon at her throat instead of an ostentatious necklace. Her hair was arranged neatly at the nape, dark and glossy, a style that suggested taste rather than fashion's tyranny. But it was not her clothing that held him. It was her composure. There was a serenity in her posture that did not ask anyone's permission. Someone near Everard laughed too loudly, and the sound snapped through the air like a whip. He blinked as if waking. His fingers tightened slightly around the stem of the champagne glass. He told himself, quietly, firmly, that noticing a woman's attentive manner did not mean anything. It was merely observation, and yet he could not seem to stop observing. The older woman moved away, guided by a niece, and the young lady remained by the windows for a moment, her hands loosely clasped before her. She watched the dancers with mild interest, not the feverish intensity of someone scanning for opportunity. The light from the chandelier caught her profile, a straight nose, a softly determined chin, lashes dark against her cheek when she blinked. Everard realized, with a faint irritation at himself, that he was already cataloging her features. Lord Pemberton returned to his side as if summoned by Everard's attention. Hosts had instincts for this sort of thing. "Raven's Hollow," Pemberton said warmly. "I must introduce you properly. Lady Delphine Whitcomb. Delphine, may I present His Grace, the Duke of Ravenshollow." The young lady turned, and in that simple movement there was no flutter, no sudden rearrangement of expression. She faced him as she would face anything she meant to regard clearly. Her eyes, gray, not pale but deep, the color of cloud-shadowed water, met his without hesitation. "Your Grace," she said, and offered her hand. Everard bowed and took it briefly, feeling the cool smoothness of her glove beneath his fingers. Her hand was steady, not rigid, not tremulous. "Lady Delphine," he replied. Pemberton, satisfied, drifted away to tend another cluster of guests, leaving them with the polite silence that followed introductions. Everard was accustomed to this moment. The moment where a conversation either finds its footing or dies quickly and mercifully. He had expected to provide the footing himself. Delphine made it unnecessary. "I observed your arrival earlier," she said, voice calm and warm, distinctly clear above the room's murmur. "You enter a room the way one enters a landscape, first to understand its shape." Everard held still. The champagne glass hovered at his side like a forgotten prop. "That is an unusual thing to say to a man you have just met." Delphine's mouth curved slightly, not in apology, but in quiet amusement. "Is it? I meant no impertinence, only truth." He studied her. The candlelight softened the planes of her face, but it did not soften the steadiness of her gaze. "And you make a habit of speaking truth to strangers?" "I make a habit of speaking truth when I can do it kindly," she replied. "A stranger is simply someone whose habits I have not yet learned." There was something in that sentence, something precise and unembellished, that pricked his attention the way a pin pricks fabric. Not painful, just startling. "You were speaking to Mrs. Hartington," he said, because he had heard the older woman addressed that way, and because it seemed safer to talk about something neutral. Delphine's eyes flicked briefly toward the far side of the room, where Mrs. Hartington had been absorbed into another group. "Yes, she was telling me about her sister's roses. They sound spectacular. She describes them as though they were soldiers marching into battle." Everard's mouth did something that might, in another man, have been called a smile. Delphine saw it. Her gaze sharpened with interest, as if she had just discovered a detail in a painting. "Ah, you do laugh. Or at least you are capable of it." He made himself breathe normally. "I am capable of many things, Lady Delphine. I simply do not display them indiscriminately." "Good," she said. "Indiscriminate displays are exhausting to witness." He laughed then, quietly, briefly, almost against his will. The sound surprised him as much as it would have surprised anyone else. It rose and vanished before he could decide what to do with it. Delphine did not look triumphant. She did not look as though she had won a game. She only looked pleased in the way one looks when something has unfolded naturally, as it should. Everard's mind, always searching for order, attempted to place her. Sir Benedict Whitcomb, Baronet, Lord Pemberton had said. Gloucestershire. An eligible young woman, certainly, but not the kind that usually drew the attention of a duke with political connections and an old estate. That was not arrogance. It was simply how his world worked. If a man like him married, there would be a dozen ambitious families pressing their daughters forward. "And you, Your Grace," she said, "have you come to Bath for the waters or the season?" Everard answered as he should have, with an elegant half-truth. "A bit of both." Delphine's brows lifted a fraction, an expression so subtle he almost missed it. "Do you find the waters helpful?" "I find them tolerable." That is a very diplomatic way of saying you dislike them. Everard's gaze narrowed slightly. "You are perceptive." "My father taught me to observe," she replied simply. "He said observation is the beginning of dignity, not to stare, not to judge, only to see what is there." The mention of her father softened her tone, but it did not make her sentimental. It was the kind of softness that came from gratitude, not need. Everard felt a strange, quiet shift inside himself, something like respect, unexpected in its speed. Most young women spoke of fathers as barriers or benefactors. Delphine spoke as if her father had been a craftsman and she his careful work. "Sir Benedict is in Bath with you?" he asked. "He arrives tomorrow," she said. "He dislikes leaving home in October. He says the land has a particular way of looking at you when you abandon it before winter." She paused. "But he came because I asked him to, and because he believes a father ought to be present when a daughter is being considered." Everard's fingers tightened minutely on the champagne glass. Considered. The word was accurate. It should have made him uncomfortable in the way accuracy sometimes does. Delphine watched him with that same steady attention, and Everard felt, with mild alarm, the sensation of being seen. Not merely looked at, but truly regarded. A set began. Couples moved toward the floor. Delphine glanced toward the musicians, then back to him. "Are you obliged to dance often?" she asked. "I am obliged to do many things," Everard replied. That was not an answer. He tipped his head slightly, conceding the point. "Not often. I can manage it when required." "And do you find it unpleasant?" "I find it performative." Delphine's expression warmed. "It is, which is why I prefer conversations by windows. One can at least breathe there." Everard looked toward the windows behind her. The glass reflected candlelight and moving silhouettes. Beyond it, the night lay cool and dark, the city's lamps making small, bright points like restrained stars. "Do you always choose the edge of the room?" he asked, surprising himself with the question. Delphine considered. "Not always, but often. The center has its own gravity. It pulls people in and flattens them. I like to stay where I can remember my own shape." Everard felt that phrase land somewhere deep, as if it had been aimed not at him, but at a part of him he did not often let anyone speak to. He had spent 8 years being pulled by gravity, family, estate, title, expectation. He had learned to hold his shape by force of will. Delphine spoke as though holding one's shape were a natural right. A young man approached Delphine then, tall, blonde, eager. He bowed, asked for the dance. Delphine declined with politeness so effortless it was almost invisible. A gentle shake of her head, a brief smile, a word offered with such warmth that the refusal could not be taken as insult. The young man moved away, not wounded, perhaps even grateful. Everard, watching, realized something else. Delphine did not wield kindness like a tool. It seemed to be simply the way she moved. "You could have accepted," Everard said, when the young man was gone. "I could have," she agreed. "Why did you not?" Delphine's gaze shifted to the dancers. "Because I did not wish to, and because I have learned that accepting invitations out of obligation makes one resentful. Resentment poisons everything quietly." Everard thought of his own life. of obligations accepted until they became the framework of his days. He wondered, not for the first time, whether he had been careful or merely resigned. A woman's laugh rose in the room, bright, practiced. Delphine's eyes flicked toward it and then away, as if she had heard the falseness in it without needing to comment. "Lady Delphine," Everard said slowly, "you speak as though you have never been desperate for anyone's approval." Delphine turned her head, and the candlelight caught the curve of her cheekbone, the slight shadow beneath her lower lip. Her expression did not harden. It became thoughtful. "I wanted my father's approval," she said. "But I had it. He gave it to me the way sunlight gives itself to a window, without making the window earn it. Once you grow up with that sort of steadiness, you do not go searching for it in strangers. You begin instead to search for recognition." Everard's chest tightened. Recognition. The word struck too close to something he had not named. "And do you find it?" he asked, voice quieter now, the room's sounds receding at the edges of his attention. Delphine's gaze held his. There was no flirtation in it. There was something more unnerving. Sincerity. "Sometimes," she said. "Not often. But when it happens, it feels like coming upon a familiar place in an unfamiliar city." Everard could not look away. He realized with a slow, unsettling clarity that he was standing at the edge of something he had not intended to approach. He had come to Bath to choose a wife as one chooses a partnership. Sound, sensible, strategic. Delphine Whitcomb, standing by the windows in simple pale silk, speaking of dignity and resentment, and recognition as though these were ordinary topics, made strategy feel suddenly insufficient. A footman passed with a tray. Everard set his untouched champagne down without thinking. His hand felt oddly empty afterward. "May I call on you tomorrow?" he asked, and felt immediately the weight of the request. Delphine did not answer at once. She looked at him the way she looked at everything, carefully, kindly, without the smallest hint of performance. Everard found himself holding his breath again, waiting not for her agreement, but for her honest assessment of whether the request was worth granting. "I will be at the pump room in the morning," she said at last. "With Mrs. Hardington and her roses, most likely. If you wish to endure both mineral water and floral warfare, you may join us." He let out the breath, almost silently, and inclined his head. "Then I will see you there." Delphine's smile then was brief, almost private. It did not ask for anything. It simply existed. As Everard moved away, because propriety required movement, and because he needed the space, he felt the room differently. The music seemed louder. The candlelight seemed sharper. The air felt warmer, as if he had been standing too close to a fire without noticing. He did not turn back to look at her again. He did not need to. He could still feel where she stood, as if some part of his mind had mapped the room around her presence. Later that night, after the supper and the last set, after the familiar goodbyes and the careful smiles, he returned to Brock Street in a carriage that smelled of leather and cold air. The city had quieted. The lamps outside made long reflections on the damp stones. The sky was clear now, and the moon, nearly full, hung above the rooftops like a pale coin. When the carriage turned, the moonlight shifted across the window and briefly lit Everard's hands in his lap, hands that had balanced ledgers, signed leases, held reins. Hands that earlier had taken Delphine Whitcomb's gloved fingers for the briefest moment, and had felt, absurdly, the steadiness in them. In the townhouse, the fire had burned low. Pennington had left a small lamp lit on the desk, the light pooling over a stack of correspondence. Everard removed his coat, loosened his cravat, and stood for a long time before that desk without sitting. He knew what he ought to do. He ought to continue to observe, to evaluate, to remember that one evening's conversation by a window did not equate to suitability for a ducal household. He ought, above all, to remember that admiration could be a form of temptation. And yet, when he finally sat and reached for a sheet of paper to make notes, because Everard Ravenshollow made notes, as if a life could be navigated by ink, he found that his mind refused to list anything about Delphine that could be measured. He could not write. Portion, connections, temperament. What came instead, uninvited and undeniable, were phrases. She listens as if words matter. She refuses without cruelty. She speaks truth kindly. She does not flatten herself for the center of a room. Everard stared at the paper until the lamp's flame trembled slightly in a draught. He felt something unfamiliar, an agitation that was not fear, not exactly, but the sense of a door opening in a house he had assumed was fully built. He set the pen down, rose, and went to the window. Outside, the moonlight lay across Brock Street. The world looked calm. The world always looked calm from behind glass. Everard pressed his fingertips briefly to the window pane, feeling the cold through the skin, and thought of Delphine's words, how she had said recognition, as if it were a thing that could change a person. He had come to Bath for duty, but as he stood there in the quiet, with the night holding the city in its still hands, Everard Ravenshollow realized something with the slow certainty of a man who had been proud of his control for too long. He was not in control of his curiosity, and curiosity, when it took root, was never a small matter. The next morning came with a thin, milky light that made Bath look freshly rinsed. The night's cold had left a damp sheen on the streets, and when Everard stepped out shortly after 9, the air met him with that particular clarity that belonged only to late October, sharp enough to wake every sense, gentle enough not to bruise them. The sun was present but restrained, hovering behind a veil of cloud in the southeast, so that the shadows were soft-edged, and the pale stone buildings seemed to glow from within, rather than blaze. He walked, rather than ride. It was not far to the pump room, and walking gave him the illusion of control, stride by stride, breath by breath, as if the steady cadence could settle what his mind refused to settle. Bath in the morning was a different creature than Bath at night. In daylight, the city's elegance had less seduction and more discipline. The shopkeepers opened their shutters with brisk precision. A boy hurried past with a basket of coal, cheeks pink from effort, his cap pulled low. A lady in a sober coat crossed the street with her skirts gathered just enough to avoid the damp, her maid following at the proper distance. Even the pigeons seemed to peck with purpose. Everard reached the pump room early enough that the room still held pockets of quiet. The orchestra was not yet playing. Instead, there was the faint shuffle of feet, the clink of porcelain, the low murmur of morning voices kept intentionally modest. The mineral water was being ladled from its source by attendants in crisp uniform, poured into small cups that looked too delicate to contain something so famously unpleasant. He took no cup. He had promised himself he would endure it, and then had decided that endurance for its own sake was a kind of vanity. He did, however, position himself near the long windows, and waited. There was a moment, he noticed it with irritation, that he found himself watching every movement near the entrance with an attention that had nothing to do with social vigilance, and everything to do with anticipation. He told himself it was merely an awareness of schedule. He told himself he was simply a punctual man. Then Delphine Whitcomb entered, and every excuse dissolved in the simple fact of her presence. She wore a walking dress of a muted blue-gray that made her eyes look darker, and a bonnet trimmed with minimal ribbon. Her gloved hands held a small reticule, and as she paused at the threshold to take in the room, her posture remained composed, neither eager nor hesitant. She did not scan the room like a hunter. She glanced, assessed, and began moving with calm certainty. Mrs. Hartington was with her, wrapped in a shawl like a queen in exile, her cane tapping lightly against the floor. The older woman's face brightened when she saw Everard, and Everard understood immediately that Mrs. Hartington was the sort who enjoyed collecting interesting acquaintances the way some women collected porcelain, proudly, and with the firm belief that they improved a room simply by being present in it. "Your Grace," Mrs. Hartington called as they approached. "How admirable of you to keep your word. Most men make promises at night and forget them by morning." Everard bowed. "Then I am pleased to be unusual, madam." Mrs. Hardington laughed, delighted, and leaned in with conspiratorial vigor. "Do not let it go to your head. I did not say most men, only most men in Bath." Delphine watched this exchange with that quiet amusement he was coming to recognize, as if she were observing not merely what was said, but what it revealed. When Everard turned to her, she offered him a greeting that felt both proper and strangely personal. "Good morning, Your Grace," she said. He noticed, because he noticed everything about her now, that she said it without the slightest uncertainty. No extra sweetness, no calculated softness. Just a clear greeting. "Good morning, Lady Delphine." His voice was steadier than his thoughts. "You look as though you've decided the day will behave itself." "I've decided," she replied, "that the day can do what it likes. I intend to behave myself regardless." Mrs. Hardington made a pleased sound, as if Delphine had just confirmed something she'd long suspected. "That is exactly what her father says," she declared. "And speaking of fathers, Delphine, tell His Grace the news, since you insist on delivering it like a sermon." Delphine's expression softened, but not into sentimentality. "My father arrived early this morning," she said. "He is settling in now. He insisted on walking from the carriage to the house, as though the act of arriving must be performed properly." Everard felt a small, inexplicable tightening in his chest. Sir Benedict, the man behind the steadiness, behind the education, behind the serenity that did not ask permission. "I hope his journey was comfortable," Everard said. "He dislikes travel," Delphine replied frankly. "But he dislikes leaving things unfinished more. He would rather endure discomfort than leave his mind in uncertainty." Everard found himself thinking. Then she learned that from him too. Mrs. Hardington had already accepted a cup of mineral water and was grimacing at it with theatrical disgust. "Ugh," she said. "It tastes like a punishment devised by someone who hated joy." "You drink it anyway," Delphine observed. "I am 82, Mrs. Hardington snapped. "At this age, I drink what I please, but I also enjoy complaining, and you cannot deprive an old woman of her hobbies." Delphine's eyes warmed. "I would never." Everard watched Delphine as she assisted Mrs. Hardington with her cup, steadying it, making sure it was held securely, offering help in a way that preserved the older woman's dignity rather than highlighting her weakness. It was not a grand gesture, not something done for applause. It was simply competence wrapped in kindness, and Everard felt again that uneasy admiration he could not quite place on his tidy internal list. They spoke for nearly half an hour in that morning room, their conversation weaving through harmless topics, and then, without strain, into things that were not harmless at all. Mrs. Hardington took delight in steering it there. "Tell me, Your Grace," she said, setting her empty cup down with a decisive clink. "Are you a man who reads, or a man who claims to read?" "I read," Everard said. Mrs. Hardington narrowed her eyes with exaggerated suspicion. "What did you last read, then? And do not say the newspapers. That is not reading. That is endurance." Everard answered honestly. "A report on drainage improvements and yield increases on estates in the north." Mrs. Hardington stared, then burst into laughter so abrupt it drew several looks. "Oh, splendid," she declared. "You are exactly the kind of man Delphine likes to torment." Delphine arched a brow.
So
"I do not torment people."
And you are
"You do,"
breathtaking,
Mrs.
my
Hardington
love.
insisted,
I feel so
pointing her
close to
cane
you.
lightly at Delphine's knee.
You look
"You do
so
it politely.
handsome tonight.
That is the worst kind."
And you are
Delphine turned to
breathtaking, my
Everard,
love.
her
I
expression
feel so
composed, and
close to-
asked, "Did it interest you?" Everard was not used to women asking him that question about estate matters without pretense. "Yes," he said after a beat. "It did." Delphine nodded once, as though she'd suspected as much. "Then it was reading," she said, "not endurance." Mrs. Hardington sighed, long and dramatic. You see, that tone, she makes pronouncements as if God himself asked her to. Delphine's mouth curved slightly. Mrs. Hardington, if God asked me anything, I suspect I would answer with far less confidence. Everard found himself studying Delphine's face as she spoke. How her eyes changed when she was amused. How her attention sharpened when an idea mattered. How her expression remained honest even when manners required restraint. It struck him, unexpectedly and with the force of sudden clarity, that her simplicity was not innocence at all. It was choice. It took him a moment to accept that he was startled by it. A young gentleman approached, another eager one, too well oiled with charm, and bowed to Delphine with the flourish of a man certain his own appeal must be irresistible. Lady Delphine, he said, I was hoping you would allow me the honor of escorting you along the crescent later. The day is perfectly suited to a stroll. Delphine did not flinch. She did not retreat into awkwardness. She looked at him directly and said, How kind of you to offer. I will be walking with Mrs. Hardington this afternoon, and later I expect to spend time with my father. I hope you enjoy the crescent. The gentleman blinked, recalibrating, then attempted a grin. Perhaps another day, then. Perhaps, Delphine said, in the tone of someone placing a book back on a shelf, neither cruel nor encouraging. He withdrew, not offended, but distinctly less confident. Mrs. Hardington leaned toward Everard and murmured, She could fell an oak with that calm. Delphine heard her anyway and replied mildly, I could not. I have no interest in felling oaks. Mrs. Hardington waved a dismissive hand. Metaphors, child. One cannot speak plainly all the time or life becomes dull. Delphine's gaze flicked to Everard's face with a quiet question in it, as if she wondered whether he preferred metaphors or plainness. Everard realized with an inward start that he preferred plainness, except when it came to his own feelings, which he had learned to fold carefully into neat, unexamined corners. They parted at last with proper farewells. Mrs. Hardington insisted on taking Delphine's arm as they left, as if to display her, and Delphine allowed it, her expression gently resigned in the way one becomes resigned to a beloved eccentricity. Everard remained in the pump room for a few minutes after they'd gone, standing near the window and watching the place where Delphine's figure had disappeared. He felt ridiculous, and he did not care. He was still standing there when Pennington approached quietly, carrying the Morning Post in his leather folder. Your Grace, he said, there is a letter from Lady Miriam. Everard's jaw tightened. He did not need to open it to know its contents. His aunt's letters always carried the faint scent of lavender and strategy. He took it anyway. He did not open it yet. The seal, dark wax stamped with the Fenchurch crest, sat under his thumb like a small, stubborn accusation. Later, Everard said. Yes, Your Grace. When Everard left the pump room, Bath's streets had brightened. The sun had pushed through the clouds with more conviction, and now sat higher, nearer to the south, casting longer, clearer shadows down the steps and along the facades. The city looked almost cheerful, an unsettling quality, as if it were pretending not to notice winter's approach. He walked back slowly, the letter unopened in his coat pocket, and found himself thinking not about his aunt's inevitable argument, but about Delphine's calm refusal, and her gentle competence, and the way she spoke of her father with a steadiness that hinted at deep loyalty rather than dependency. By noon, the townhouse felt too quiet. Everard took the letter to his desk and sat down, placing it flat on the wood, aligning it with the desk's edge as if neatness could make what followed easier. He broke the seal. Lady Miriam did not waste ink on politeness. Everard read, his eyes moving with controlled speed over the lines his aunt had laid down with elegant firmness. There it was, the suggestion of Lady Catherine Aldebridge, young, well-born, richly connected, her dowry substantial, her father influential. There was mention of shifting political winds and the importance of securing the Raven's Hollow position in an increasingly uncertain age. There was the thinly veiled rebuke of his delay, the implied warning that other men would not hesitate. Everard finished the letter, folded it, and set it down. For several seconds he did nothing at all. He stared at the lamplight on the desk as if it might rearrange itself into an answer. Lady Catherine Aldebridge was, in every outward sense, the sort of match people expected him to make. He could picture the wedding in broad strokes, a splendid service, approval in the newspapers, satisfied relatives, the quiet relief of servants. He could picture a future laid out like a properly swept path. And yet, in the quiet that followed his reading, what rose in him was not relief. It was resistance, not to the idea of marriage itself. He was not childish, and he had never pretended he would live forever unmarried. But to the idea of being steered into it by strategy alone, as though his life were merely a vessel for other people's anxieties. He thought of Delphine near the windows, saying she liked to remain where she could remember her own shape. He thought of her calm refusal, her gentle truth. He thought of her saying resentment poisons everything quietly. Everard closed his eyes and felt something like a decision beginning, not fully formed, not yet spoken aloud, but present, like the first pressure of weather changing. That afternoon, at precisely 4, Everard's carriage took him along the crescent. The sky had turned again, clouds returning in layers from the west, and the light had the softened quality of late day. The sun, lower now, beginning its descent, slanted through gaps in the clouds and made the pale stone blaze in brief, dramatic flashes, then dim again, like a candle flickering behind gauze. He had been invited to tea at the Whitcombs' temporary lodging on Milsom Street, an invitation conveyed through Mrs. Hardington with the delighted efficiency of someone who considered matchmaking a moral duty. Everard had accepted without hesitation, then spent an entire hour afterwards questioning why he had accepted so quickly. The drawing room was modest by ducal standards, but tasteful. Everything was arranged with quiet care. Flowers placed not to impress but to please, books on a side table. A fire laid ready, though not fully lit, as if they were waiting for the temperature to decide what it wanted to be. Delphine greeted him at the door, and behind her, in the shadowed hall, stood Sir Benedict Whitcomb. Everard felt, in that first moment of seeing Delphine with her father, a shift in perspective. She looked neither smaller nor larger beside him, simply connected, as if a strong root ran between them. Sir Benedict stepped forward. He was a man in his late 50s, broad-shouldered, with hair gone mostly gray and eyes that carried the same calm attention as his daughter's. His expression held no servile delight at a duke's presence, nor did it hold any defiant stiffness. It was the expression of a man who had nothing to prove and nothing to sell. "Your Grace," Sir Benedict said, and offered his hand. Everard took it. The baronet's grip was firm, an honest handshake rather than a social symbol. "Sir Benedict," Everard replied. Delphine watched them with a stillness that made Everard feel, again, that he was being evaluated, not for wealth or title, but for substance. Tea was served. Conversation began politely, then, almost inevitably, turned to land. Everard could not have explained how it happened. It simply did. Sir Benedict asked a direct question about crop rotation and tenant cottages, questions that were not meant to flatter Everard by suggesting his competence, but meant to test whether his competence was real. Everard answered directly. He did not embellish. He admitted where difficulties remained. He spoke of repairs that took longer than one wished, of men injured in harvest, of the particular challenge of keeping a large estate stable when the world beyond it changed. Sir Benedict listened without interruption. Delphine listened too, her gaze on Everard's face, not in dreamy admiration, but in sharp, quiet attention. When Everard finished, there was a brief pause in which the crackle of the fire and the faint sound of carriage wheels outside became suddenly noticeable. Sir Benedict nodded once. "You speak like a man who has actually walked his fields," he said. Everard felt something close to pride, though he did not allow it to show. I have, he said. Often. Good, Sir Benedict said simply, and reached for his tea. Delphine did not smile in triumph. She merely exhaled slightly, and Everard realized she had been holding her breath. Later, when Sir Benedict excused himself briefly, to see whether the staff has arranged my trunk properly, since they've already decided to do it wrong, he said with dry humor. Delphine and Everard found themselves near the window again. Outside, the late afternoon had deepened into early dusk, and the sky held a bruised purple color in the east, while the west remained faintly bright, as if unwilling to surrender. Delphine spoke quietly. He likes you. Everard blinked. That was quick. Delphine's eyes warmed faintly. He's quick. When he trusts someone, he does it fully. When he does not, he keeps his distance with equal thoroughness. And what does he require for trust? Everard asked, though he suspected he already knew. Delphine considered him. Consistency, she said. Kindness that is not performed. Strength that does not require cruelty. Everard felt the words sink in, not as flattery but as a standard, one he was not entirely sure he always met. Delphine's gaze remained steady. Your Grace, she added softly, and there was something in her tone, something careful, that suggested she was stepping into a more serious terrain. May I ask you something plainly? Yes, he said at once. Why did you come to Bath? She asked. Everard's instincts rose. Those old habits of deflection, diplomacy, half-truths. He could have said duty. He could have said the waters. He could have said society. He looked at Delphine's face in the fading light, saw her waiting not for charm, but for honesty, and found he could not insult her with evasion. I came because I was told it was time, he said. Time to choose a wife. Time to put an end to everyone's anxieties, including my own, perhaps. Delphine's expression did not change dramatically. It only sharpened, as if she were focusing on a distant object. And now? She asked. Everard's throat tightened. He did not know how to say what he felt without sounding foolish, and he hated sounding foolish. Now, he said carefully, I find that I am less willing to make a choice that is merely correct. Delphine held his gaze. The room's warm lamplight framed her face, and outside, the first street lamps were beginning to glow, small and steady against the coming night. Correct can be very cold, Delphine said softly. Yes, Everard replied, and surprised himself by the quiet intensity in his own voice. It can. Footsteps in the hall signaled Sir Benedict's return, and the moment folded back into propriety, like a letter returned to its envelope. The conversation shifted. The hour ended. Everard took his leave at the appropriate time, bowed to Delphine, shook Sir Benedict's hand again, and stepped out into the cool dusk with the strange sensation of having just walked out of a room where something invisible had changed shape. On the carriage ride back to Brock Street, he watched the lamps blur past the window, each one briefly illuminating the glass before sliding away behind him. The motion of the carriage had a soothing rhythm, wheel over stone, yet his mind refused to settle. Lady Miriam's letter lay in his pocket like a weight. Delphine's plain question, why did you come to Bath, lay deeper, where no pocket could contain it. That night, Everard sat at his desk with a fresh sheet of paper and began a reply to his aunt. He wrote the first line, paused, crossed it out, wrote another, and then stopped entirely, pen hovering above the page. He realized, with a sudden, almost grim clarity, that the letter to Lady Miriam was not the most difficult one he would have to write. The most difficult would be the one he had not yet admitted he wanted to write. The one to Delphine Whitcomb, telling her, plainly, that his admiration had begun to turn into something more dangerous than admiration. And dangerous, he understood now, did not always mean ruin. Sometimes it meant truth. He set the pen down. Outside, Bath slept beneath a sky that had finally cleared, stars sharp as pins. The moon had shifted westward, and its light fell across the desk, silvering the edge of Lady Miriam's letter, where it sat half exposed in Everard's coat pocket. Everard rose and went again to the window, looking out at the quiet street, and for the first time in a long time, he did not feel comforted by order. He felt summoned by possibility. Everard did not approach Sir Benedict as a man seeking permission to claim a prize. He approached him as a man asking to be examined, and in that difference lay the first quiet proof of how thoroughly Delphine Whitcomb had already altered his instincts. The card-room's lamplight made a soft halo on the ceiling, and the air held the mingled scents of beeswax, warmed wool, and the faintly sweet residue of sherry. Nearby, laughter rose and fell in practiced waves, as if the room itself inhaled and exhaled amusement on cue. But around Everard, around the few feet of space where he stood, everything felt sharper, more precise, as though time had narrowed into the exact width of a single decision. Sir Benedict's gaze met his without yielding. The baronet's face was not unkind, but it was not indulgent either. He looked like a man who had watched storms move over his land and learned to read the sky without being fooled by pretty clouds. "You have something to say to me," Sir Benedict remarked. "Yes," Everard answered, and he did not lower his voice as though embarrassed by sincerity. "I do. I would like your permission to court your daughter." Delphine, just to Everard's left, did not step back or soften into performative modesty. Her posture remained calm, her shoulders relaxed, her hands folded loosely, and her eyes, those steady gray eyes, stayed on her father's face, not Everard's. It was not a rejection. It was respect. She was allowing her father to respond as her father and allowing herself to remain fully present as the person whose life was being discussed. Sir Benedict said nothing for a moment, and Everard felt the silence in his ribs, steadying himself within it. Across the room, a gentleman made an exaggerated groan over a card hand and earned a ripple of laughter, and the normal world continued as if this smaller world of three people did not exist. At last Sir Benedict asked, "Court her toward what end, your grace?" Everard's jaw tightened slightly, not with anger, but with the awareness that the question mattered. "Toward marriage," he said plainly. "If she should choose me. If you should see fit to allow it." Delphine's eyes flicked toward Everard then, and in that glance he felt her attention like sunlight finding an opening in cloud. Quiet, deliberate, warm enough to be unmistakable. It was the first time he had heard himself say the word marriage out loud in connection with her, and the fact that it did not feel like a bargain startled him. Sir Benedict's gaze remained fixed. "You are a duke," he said, almost as if he were reminding Everard that titles were real things with real weight, capable of crushing. "You understand that my daughter is not a trophy. She is not a remedy for your family's concerns." Everard did not flinch. "I understand," he said, "and I would not insult her by pretending this season in Bath is innocent of calculations. But I have stopped treating her as part of one." Sir Benedict's brows moved slightly, an almost invisible reaction, but a reaction nonetheless. "And if she refuses you?" Sir Benedict asked. Everard's throat tightened, because the thought was suddenly vivid. Delphine saying no with that calm finality that would offer no cruelty and no hope. "Then I will accept it," he said. "I would be disappointed. I would be—" He paused, choosing honesty over pride. "More than disappointed. But I would not punish her for having a will." Sir Benedict held him in silence another moment. Then, unexpectedly, he turned his head and looked at Delphine. "Delphine," he said, "what do you want?" Delphine did not glance away, did not blush theatrically, did not attempt to smooth the moment into something smaller. She answered, as if she had been asked whether she preferred rain or sun. "I want to be courted only if it is real," she said. "I want to be free to say yes and free to say no. and to be treated the same either way. And I want you." Her eyes settled on her father for an instant, tenderness contained within strength, to trust that I will not be dazzled into harm. Sir Benedict's face softened just a fraction, not into sentimentality, but into that familiar, quiet warmth that comes from years of loving someone responsibly. He looked back at Everard. "Very well," Sir Benedict said. "You may court her, but understand the rules of my blessing." He lifted one hand, counting off nothing with his fingers, because he had no need of gestures to give his words weight. "You will not rush her. You will not corner her. You will not use your title to make her feel small. And you will not speak of marriage to anyone else as if it is settled before she has settled it herself." Everard felt an odd, steady relief. These were not obstacles. They were the only conditions that made sense. "I accept," he said. "All of it." Delphine exhaled, slow and controlled, as if she had been holding her breath since the moment Everard first stepped forward. Then she looked at Everard again, and there it was, an expression so contained that most people would have missed it entirely. Approval. Not because he was a duke, because he had agreed to treat her freedom as sacred. From that night onward, Bath shifted. It was not that the city changed, it was that Everard began to move through it with a different awareness, as if some internal instrument had been recalibrated. The same streets, the same pale stone terraces, the same neat hedges and orderly gardens. Yet now he noticed how often he looked for her without meaning to. He noticed how the day seemed to have a spine when he knew he would see her, and how it sagged when he did not. They began properly, as propriety demanded. Mornings at the pump room, where people performed health with mineral water and performed interest with polite conversation, became predictable points of meeting, their exchanges protected by the presence of Mrs. Hartington and the natural bustle of society. The pump room's daily routine had been practiced for generations, and that familiarity gave Everard a strange comfort, as though the building itself knew how to hold complicated feelings in its high-ceilinged composure. Delphine would arrive with her father or with Mrs. Hartington, and Everard would join them, and their conversation would be light enough for public ears, but threaded with something deeper. Small signals, small truths, the quiet work of learning someone. Afternoons brought walks in Sydney Gardens or along the gravel walk, always accompanied, always visible enough to keep rumor from sharpening into scandal. The old rules of public courtship were not written on the walls, but they lived in everyone's eyes. Introductions, chaperones, and careful distance were the invisible rails on which reputation moved. Everard, who had never questioned such rails before, began to resent them, not because they restrained passion, but because they sometimes restrained honesty. Evenings offered assemblies, dinners, concerts, theater, and with each event, a new awareness grew in him, that Delphine was not simply well-mannered. She was deliberately so. Manners were not her mask, they were her instrument, and she used them with quiet mastery. It was in the second week of this courtship, on a Wednesday whose sky had cleared into a high, cold blue, that Everard discovered the thing that truly shocked him. He had called at the Whitcombs' lodging on Milsom Street in the late afternoon, as he had been invited to do. The sun, already declining toward the west, cast long, oblique beams across the street, turning windows into pale mirrors and making the stone glow as if lit from behind. He arrived precisely at 4, because he was still Everard Ravenshollow, and he could not rid himself of punctuality any more than he could rid himself of his name. A maid admitted him. The sitting room was empty, fire laid but not lit, curtains half drawn against the chill. Everard waited, hat in hand, for only a moment before hearing voices from the adjoining room. Low, urgent, masculine and feminine. Delphine's voice. His instinct was to retreat, to cough and announce himself. But what held him still was not curiosity alone. It was the tone. Delphine did not sound flustered. She sounded authoritative. He heard a man's voice, Sir Benedict's steward or man of business perhaps, saying something about an account, about a delayed payment, about a tenant who would not have enough to make it through winter if certain repairs were not postponed. The words came quick, practical, edged with worry. Delphine replied calmly, and Everard caught enough to understand the shape of it. She was correcting the steward. Not gently, precisely. "You've counted the costs without counting the consequence," she said, and there was steel under the courtesy. "If you postpone repairs to the east cottages, you will pay twice, once in money, once in illness, and illness does not wait for ledgers." The steward began to protest, and Delphine cut through it, not with cruelty, but with the clean decisiveness of someone who had studied and thought, and would not allow himself to be soothed by excuses. "I'm not asking your opinion," she said. "I'm asking for the numbers. Give me the exact total of what is owed, what is due, and what can be shifted without breaking faith." There was a pause, then papers rustled. Everard stood in the sitting room as if anchored. He had expected Delphine to be educated, refined, perhaps even unusually intelligent. He had not expected this. A young lady commanding an estate matter with the competence of a man who had been doing it for years. The door opened, and Delphine stepped into the sitting room with a folder of papers in her hands. For a fraction of a second, surprise crossed her face at seeing Everard there, silent. Then her expression rearranged itself, not into embarrassment, but into calm acknowledgement. "Your Grace," she said. "I'm sorry. I did not know you'd been kept waiting." "I have not been kept waiting," Everard said, and his voice came out lower than he intended. He looked at the folder in her hands. "That was you speaking just now." Delphine glanced down at the papers, then back at him. "Yes." Everard felt the words form in him before he could refine them. "You are not what I assumed. You are far more." He swallowed the clumsiness of it and said instead, "You manage those matters?" Delphine's mouth curved faintly, but there was no teasing, only truth. "I assist my father. He has always included me. He said it would be cruel to raise me to be helpless and call it femininity." Everard stared at her, and in that moment the story he had unconsciously told himself. Simple baronet's daughter, quiet family, suitable and sweet, fell apart like brittle paper. This woman was not merely sweet. She was trained, prepared. She could look at a problem and see through it. He heard Sir Benedict's voice behind her, approaching from the adjoining room. "Ah," the baronet said, stepping in. "Ravenshollow. Good timing." Delphine was about to out-argue a man who has been doing accounts since before she was born. Delphine lifted her chin slightly, not in defiance, but in the calm pride of competence. "He was wrong," she said simply. Sir Benedict chuckled, and the sound held genuine affection. "She's right," he told Everard. "Nearly always." Everard felt something shift in him then, admiration deepening into a kind of awe that unsettled him, because awe was not a feeling he commonly allowed. He had thought he needed a wife who could host dinners and smile politely at bishops. Delphine could do that, of course, but she could also keep people warm in winter, because she understood that budgets were not merely numbers, they were lives. When they finally sat, tea served, and the fire lit because the hour had begun to cool, Everard found himself watching Delphine in a new way. He noticed the quiet confidence with which she poured tea, the careful politeness she offered to the maid, the way she asked Everard questions that were not merely conversational, but thoughtful, as if she were learning the architecture of his mind. "You handle responsibility naturally," he said at one point, unable to keep the observation to himself. Delphine did not deny it, nor did she preen. "I handle it because I was given it," she replied. "People become what they are treated as. My father treated me as capable. So I had to become capable, or disappoint him. Sir Benedict, listening, said quietly, "You did not become capable to please me. You became capable because you are the sort of person who refuses to waste what she is given." Delphine's gaze softened toward him, and Everard felt something twist in his chest, an emotion that had the shape of envy but was not petty. It was the ache of witnessing a love that had been steady and formative, a love that had built a person rather than bruised her. And then, because Bath could not allow anything pure to remain untested, the pressure arrived. It came first as gossip, soft, insinuating. Everard caught it in glances, in the slight pause when he entered a room and Delphine was already there. He heard it in the way certain ladies spoke of Delphine with faintly sharpened praise. "So sensible," they would say. "So composed, almost unusually so." As if composure were suspicious. As if a woman who did not flutter must be hiding something. Then Lady Miriam arrived in Bath. Everard learned it from Pennington at breakfast. The secretary's face remained neutral, but his voice carried the faintest note of warning, the way a man might warn another that the weather had changed. "Lady Miriam Fenchurch arrived this morning, Your Grace," Pennington said. "She has taken rooms at the Royal Crescent. She sent word she intends to call this afternoon." Everard set his cup down with controlled care. Of course she did. Lady Miriam was not wicked. Wickedness required excess, and Lady Miriam was far too disciplined for that. She was, however, formidable, a woman who had survived her husband's death, managed her own finances, and carved influence out of sheer intelligence. Everard respected her. He also knew that being the object of her plans felt like being placed on a chessboard. She arrived at 4 precisely, swept into the sitting room with lavender in her wake, and a gaze that seemed to measure the house as if assessing its strategic value. She kissed Everard's cheek, sat without being invited, and began. "You are being discussed," she said. Everard did not bother to pretend ignorance. "I am always being discussed." "Not like this." Lady Miriam leaned forward slightly. "People are saying you have grown attached to a baronet's daughter, that you are allowing sentiment to override sense." Everard's jaw tightened. "People say many things." Lady Miriam's eyes sharpened. "Everard, you have a duty to Ravenshollow." "I am aware." "And Lady Catherine is in Bath," Lady Miriam continued, voice smooth as polished stone. "She is an exceptional match. Her father is willing. The portion is significant. The connections—" "I have met Lady Catherine," Everard interrupted, more sharply than he intended. Lady Miriam paused, then smiled as if she'd found a crack in his composure. "And?" Everard held her gaze. "She is accomplished." Lady Miriam's smile widened slightly. "And not a baronet's daughter." Everard felt heat rise under his collar. "Lady Delphine Whitcomb is not a category," he said. "She is a person." Lady Miriam's eyes did not blink. "Yes," she said softly. "And you, my dear nephew, are not free. That is the difficulty. You were born into obligations that do not care about your feelings." Everard leaned back, forcing himself to breathe evenly. "And yet," he said, "I must live my life, not merely manage it." Lady Miriam studied him for a long moment. Then she said quietly, "Do you love her?" The question struck him cleanly. Love. He had been circling the word, approaching it like a man approaching a cliff in fog, not quite willing to admit how close he was to the edge. "I respect her," he said finally. Lady Miriam's gaze did not soften. "Respect is not love." Everard stared at the fire for a moment, watching a log shift and release a small burst of sparks that rose and vanished. "It is becoming something," he admitted. Lady Miriam sat back with a sigh that was almost pitying. "Then be careful," she said. "Because if you choose her, you will not only choose a wife, you will choose a storm." Everard met her eyes again. "And if I do not choose her," he said quietly, "I will choose a life that feels like winter even when the sun shines." Lady Miriam's expression changed, subtly, briefly. Not approval, not surrender, but recognition of a kind she could not dismiss. She rose, smoothed her gloves, and looked down at him. "Very well," she said. "Court her then, but do not expect the world to clap." After she left, the house felt colder, though the fire still burned. Everard did not go to Delphine immediately. Pride, caution, and propriety all argued against it. Instead, he walked, hard, fast, through Bath streets until the movement burned some of the tension out of his blood. By the time he arrived near the assembly rooms, the sky had turned a deepening slate, the last light squeezed thin at the horizon. Gas lamps were being lit again, one by one, steady flames defying the dusk. He found Delphine that evening at a small musical hosted by a family of moderate rank. Enough refinement for good music, enough intimacy for real conversation. The room was crowded but not suffocating, the piano gleaming under lamplight. Delphine sat near the window with Mrs. Hartington, listening to a soprano with the same serious attention she gave to everything. When Everard approached, her eyes lifted, and she saw at once that something had tightened in him. "What is it?" she asked softly, when the song ended and applause covered their words. Everard leaned closer, not improper, but intimate enough that he could speak quietly. "My aunt arrived today," he said. Delphine's expression did not change dramatically. Only her eyes sharpened. "Lady Miriam?" "Yes." Mrs. Hartington made a disgusted sound, loud enough that a few people glanced over. "That woman could freeze brandy," she muttered. Delphine ignored the remark. "What did she say?" she asked Everard. Everard hesitated. In the candlelit room, with music still vibrating faintly in the air, he suddenly understood how easily words could wound. "She reminded me of my duty," he said carefully, "and of Lady Catherine." Delphine's face went still. Not cold, not angry, but controlled. Everard felt a sudden fear that he might have misstepped, that in naming Lady Catherine he had accidentally placed Delphine in the position of competitor, which she would despise. "I see," Delphine said quietly. Everard's throat tightened. "Delphine." She lifted a hand slightly, not to stop him, but to steady the moment. "Do not reassure me," she said, voice calm. "If you choose me, I will not accept it as a consolation prize. If you choose her, I will not hate you for being what you are. But I will not—" She paused, and in that pause he heard the steel she usually kept hidden. "I will not linger in uncertainty simply because it is convenient for others." Everard stared at her, struck by the clean honesty of it. He felt in that instant how much he wanted her not only as a wife, but as a companion who would never allow him to become less than himself. "What do you want from me?" he asked, voice low.
Breathtaking, my love.
Delphine met his gaze fully. "A pattern," she said. "Not words. Not a promise spoken once. A pattern you will live even when it costs you something." Everard's chest tightened. He nodded, once. "Then watch," he said again, "and judge me fairly." Delphine's expression softened just slightly, as if his steadiness had given her something to stand on. "I will," she said. That night, Everard returned to Brock Street and wrote to Lady Miriam. The letter was not long. It did not contain speeches. It contained only one truth, stated with the clarity of a man who had finally decided that evasions were a kind of cowardice. He would court Lady Delphine Whitcomb. He would not pursue Lady Catherine. He would not be pushed into marriage as if it were merely a transaction. He understood the consequences, and he accepted them. He sealed the letter, rang for Pennington, and handed it over. Pennington took it with his usual restraint, but his eyes, briefly, held something like relief. "Very good, Your Grace," he said, and left without another word. Everard stood alone in the lamplight, listening to the quiet house, feeling the strange calm that followed a choice made honestly. He did not yet know what the cost would be. He only knew he had stopped lying to himself about what he wanted. Outside, Beth slept beneath a cold sky. The moon sat high, pale and steady, and its light fell across the desk like a sheet of silver. Everard looked at that light and thought, with an almost painful tenderness, of Delphine's face in candlelight, her eyes steady, her voice calm, as she demanded not reassurance, but truth lived repeatedly. And for the first time in his adult life, duty did not feel like a chain. It felt like something he could carry without bending, because he was carrying it toward a person who would never ask him to become smaller in order to be loved. 2 days after Everard sent his letter to Lady Miriam, Bath developed the particular hush it always took on before something unpleasant happened. It was not a literal silence. There were still carriage wheels on stone, still the calls of street sellers, still the ordinary bustle of servants and shopkeepers. But there was a tightening in the way people held their faces, a subtle sharpening in the way conversations paused when someone new entered a room. The season had always been a performance, and Bath was always the stage. But some performances carried more risk than others, and the audience could smell it before the curtain even rose. Everard noticed it first at breakfast, when Pennington placed the morning correspondence at his elbow, with a care that was slightly more deliberate than usual. "There's a note from Lord Aldebridge's secretary, Your Grace," Pennington said, expression neutral. Everard did not reach for it at once. He cut a piece of toast he didn't want, and watched the knife move as if precision in small things might keep larger ones from spilling. "What does it say?" "A request for the honor of your company at tea this afternoon," Pennington replied. "At their lodging near the Crescent." Everard's jaw tightened. It was not surprising. Lady Miriam would have wasted no time in placing pressure where she could. But there was something in the timing, so soon after his letter, that carried a faint sharpness, the impression of a countermove. He finally opened the note. The wording was impeccable. It assumed nothing while implying everything. It did not mention Lady Catherine directly, but the scent of her was in every line. Everard folded it once and set it aside. "Decline," he said. Pennington did not blink. "Yes, Your Grace." When Pennington had gone, Everard sat for a moment with the quiet heat of irritation in his chest, then forced it down. Irritation was easy. It was the mind's way of pretending it had control. What he needed was steadiness. At 11 he walked, again, because his body insisted on motion when his life refused to remain orderly. The sky was a low sheet of gray, and the air smelled of damp wool and fallen leaves. The sun was somewhere above the clouds, but it gave no warmth. It was merely a paler patch in an otherwise uniform sky. A wind moved along the streets with the slow insistence of something that had all day to do its work. He found himself, without making a deliberate decision, turning toward the pump room. He told himself he was going because it was a reliable place to encounter Delphine without impropriety. He told himself that in a place designed for routine, he might feel less unsettled. The truth was more human and far less dignified. He wanted to see her face. The pump room had always been both ritual and theater, a place where visitors gathered to take the waters and to be seen taking them, as if health and reputation could be maintained by the same public discipline. That morning the room was already busy. Cups of mineral water lifted with grim determination, polite laughter offered in small doses, the quiet scrape of chairs and the murmur of news exchanged as if it were currency. Delphine stood near the windows, as she often did, with Mrs. Hardington seated beside her like a benevolent tyrant. Sir Benedict was there too, speaking with a gentleman Everard recognized as a local landowner. Delphine's posture was calm, her expression attentive, but when she noticed Everard entering, something brightened in her eyes with such contained warmth that it struck him almost like pain. He approached, bowed to Mrs. Hardington, greeted Sir Benedict, then turned to Delphine. "You look as though you've been walking in weather on purpose," Delphine observed. Everard's mouth moved toward something like a smile. It helps me think. Mrs. Hardington snorted. Thinking is overrated. Most people use it as an excuse to delay. Delphine's eyes flicked to Mrs. Hardington with affectionate tolerance, then back to Everard. "And have you decided anything with all this thinking?" she asked, softly enough that the words belonged to them alone. Everard held her gaze. "Yes," he said, "and I am going to prove it with action, not conversation." Delphine's expression remained composed, but he saw the slight shift in her breathing, the way her shoulders settled as if she had been bracing without admitting it. She did not ask what he meant. She simply trusted him enough to wait. It was later that afternoon, after a luncheon where Everard spoke little and listened poorly, after a visit from a cousin who talked too much and meant too well, that the first true blow landed. It arrived, absurdly, in the form of a smile. Everard entered a drawing room at a private residence on Gay Street, where a small gathering had assembled for tea, and a woman he barely knew, Lady Bramwell, the wife of a minor peer, looked up at him with an expression of bright, false sweetness. "Your Grace," she said, "how devoted you are these days." Everard's instincts sharpened. "Devoted to what, Lady Bramwell?" Oh. She laughed lightly, as though she were embarrassed to have spoken aloud something everyone else had apparently been whispering. "To Lady Delphine, of course. How very romantic." The room's attention tilted toward him, subtle and hungry. Everard felt it the way one feels a change in air pressure before rain. He kept his voice even. "Is that considered remarkable?" Lady Bramwell's smile widened. "Only that people assumed you would be more ambitious." There it was. The knife slid in under the lace of compliment. Everard looked at her without warmth. "Perhaps people misunderstand what ambition looks like." A gentleman nearby chuckled, a little too loudly, trying to smooth the moment. Lady Bramwell fluttered her hand. "Oh, of course. I meant nothing. Only, well, you know how Bath is. Everyone discusses everyone." Everard's gaze stayed on her face. "Yes," he said calmly, "and sometimes those discussions reveal more about the speakers than about their subject." The conversation moved on, but the damage remained like a stain. Everard stayed only long enough to satisfy propriety, then left, his steps controlled, his anger cold and clean. On the carriage ride back, he stared out at the damp stone and gaslit windows and felt, with a grim clarity, the shape of the problem. Delphine was being punished not for wrongdoing, but for not playing the expected role. A baronet's daughter was meant to be grateful for a duke's attention and eager for the elevation it implied. Delphine was neither grateful nor eager. She was calm. She was competent. She was, in the eyes of small-minded people, dangerous, because she could not be easily reduced. And Everard, by choosing her, had become dangerous as well, because he was refusing to be steered. When he arrived at Brock Street, Pennington was waiting with another note. "Lady Miriam called while you were out," Pennington said. Everard took the note, read it, and felt his temper tighten again. His aunt's message was brief. She requested his presence that evening, urgently, at her rooms. Everard stared at the paper, then said, "Send word that I will call at 9. Pennington hesitated, just for a fraction of a second. "Yes, Your Grace." At 9, Everard arrived at Lady Miriam's rooms near the Crescent. The building smelled of fresh polish and expensive coal. A maid admitted him with a respectful look that suggested even servants knew Lady Miriam's temper. Lady Miriam greeted him in a sitting room lit warmly by lamps and a fierce fire. She was alone, dressed in dark silk that made her pale face more striking. She did not offer him tea. She did not offer him comfort. "You are making yourself the season's entertainment," she said, without preamble. Everard removed his gloves slowly. "I had not realized I was responsible for other people's boredom." Lady Miriam's eyes narrowed. "Do not be flippant. Everard met her gaze. Then do not treat me as a pawn. A silence stretched between them, taut as a string. In it, Everard saw something he had not wanted to see. That Lady Miriam's severity was, at least in part, fear. Not fear of scandal alone. Fear of instability. Of the world shifting under their feet. Of the old assurances failing. Lady Catherine's father is displeased, Lady Miriam said. You declined tea. You declined dinner. You declined the opportunity to be sensible. Everard's voice remained calm. I declined the opportunity to be managed. Lady Miriam's mouth tightened. And you have chosen instead a young woman who will bring you no political advantage. Everard leaned forward slightly. She will bring me something far rarer than political advantage, he said quietly. A marriage that does not require me to lie. Lady Miriam's eyes flashed. And what of the estate? What of the future? What of my life? Everard interrupted, more sharply now. Do you imagine I have no right to it? Do you imagine that a title means I am obligated to marry a stranger simply because the mathematics are pleasing? Lady Miriam stood abruptly, crossed to the window, and looked out at the night as if the darkness might offer better arguments. When she spoke again, her voice was lower. Everard, she said, I have watched men ruin themselves for love. Everard rose too, though he kept a respectful distance. And I have watched men ruin themselves without it, he replied, slowly, respectably, with perfect manners. Lady Miriam turned back, and for the first time her composure cracked just enough to reveal something raw behind it. You will face resistance, she said. From the Aldebridge set, from your own relations, from every woman in Bath who thinks your choice reflects on hers. They will say she trapped you. They will say she bewitched you. They will say she is too clever, too calm, too... Her mouth tightened. Too prepared. Everard's face hardened. Then let them say it. Lady Miriam studied him, and something in her expression shifted. Not approval, not surrender, but a reluctant respect for resolve. If you are determined, she said finally, then be determined publicly. Half measures will destroy her. Everard felt the truth of that settle. Lady Miriam was right, and it stung because she was right for the wrong reasons. He bowed. Thank you, he said, and meant it, though the gratitude tasted bitter. Good night, Aunt. He left the crescent with a mind cleared by the cold. The night air hit his face like a slap, and he welcomed it again. The sky was clouded, the moon hidden, the streets lit by gas lamps that made the wet stones shine like dark glass. He did not go home. He went instead to Milsom Street. Not to see Delphine, that would have been improper at that hour, and he would not give Bath the satisfaction of truth twisted into scandal, but to leave a note for Sir Benedict, requesting a meeting the following morning at 10. When Everard finally returned to Brock Street, it was nearly midnight. He slept in brief, shallow stretches, waking as if his mind refused to let him rest until he had finished what it had begun. Morning arrived with rain. Not the dramatic rain of novels, but the steady, quiet kind that soaked everything evenly and made the city smell of wet stone and cold earth. The sun did not appear at all. The light was gray and consistent, as if the sky had decided that drama was unnecessary. At 10, Everard stood in the Whitcombs' sitting room with rainwater darkening the hem of his coat. Sir Benedict sat opposite him, hands folded, expression attentive. Delphine was present too, seated slightly to the side, not removed, not hidden, but not forcing herself into the conversation either. She held a small piece of embroidery in her hands, but Everard noticed she did not stitch. The needle rested idle. Her attention was fully on him. Everard looked from Sir Benedict to Delphine and said plainly, "The pressure has begun." Sir Benedict nodded once. It was inevitable. Everard's jaw tightened. "They're discussing her," he said, and the possessive heat in him startled him. because he had rarely felt possessive of anything except his responsibilities. They're implying motives. They're suggesting she is ambitious. Delphine's expression did not change. She only lowered her gaze to her idle needle, as if she were steadying herself through stillness. Sir Benedict said calmly, "And what do you intend to do, Your Grace?" Everard turned toward Delphine then, because the answer belonged to her as much as it belonged to Sir Benedict. "I intend to ask her to marry me," Everard said. The words landed in the room with a quiet weight. The rain continued against the window, steady and insistent, as if time itself were pressing forward. Delphine lifted her eyes to his. Her face did not soften into a dreamy smile. It became more serious, more intent, and Everard understood with a sudden respect that this would not be a scene of easy acceptance. "Why now?" Delphine asked. Everard answered honestly. "Because waiting will hurt you," he said. "Because half measures will invite cruelty. Because I have been deliberate long enough to become cowardly, and I refuse to be that man." Delphine's breath moved slowly. "And if I say no?" Everard swallowed. "Then I will accept it," he said. "But I will not pretend I asked only because it was convenient." Sir Benedict watched them both, silent, as if he were letting the truth reveal itself without interference. Delphine looked down for a moment, at her hands, at the embroidery, at the needle that had not moved. And when she looked up again, her eyes were bright with something she held tightly in check. "I will not be a rebellion," she said quietly. "I will not be the woman you marry to prove you are strong enough to defy your family." Everard stepped forward a fraction, careful not to invade her space, careful not to turn intensity into pressure. "You are not my rebellion," he said. "You are my recognition. You are the person I saw and could not unsee." Delphine's throat moved as she swallowed. Her face remained composed, but Everard saw the effort behind it, the careful control of a woman who had been taught dignity, not as decoration, but as armor. Sir Benedict finally spoke. "Delphine," he said gently, "you are allowed to want happiness without apologizing for it." Delphine's eyes flicked to her father, and in that glance Everard saw the whole history of them. Years of trust, years of quiet preparation, years of love that had not made her dependent, but had made her capable of standing. She looked back at Everard. "If you ask me," she said, voice steady, "you must ask me in a way that leaves me free." Everard nodded once. "Then I will," he said. The proposal did not happen in that sitting room. Delphine refused, politely but firmly, to accept something so life-altering in a room that felt like a negotiation chamber, with rain at the windows and all of Bath's pressure lurking beyond the walls. She asked instead for a walk that afternoon. Rain permitting, Sir Benedict agreed to accompany them at a proper distance. Mrs. Hartington, upon hearing of it, declared she would attend as well, to prevent anyone from saying I wasn't there to witness history, and then was bribed into remaining indoors by the promise of excellent cake. By 3, the rain had eased into a thin mist. The air outside was cold enough to make Delphine's breath faintly visible when she exhaled. The gardens were damp, the paths darkened by moisture, the trees nearly bare now, their branches like fine lines drawn against the gray sky. The light was diffuse and gentle, with no sun to mark the hours, and yet Everard noticed the subtle shift of afternoon into late afternoon, by the way the air cooled another degree, and the mist thickened slightly. Delphine walked beside him with her hands tucked into her muff, her bonnet ribbon tied neatly beneath her chin. She looked straight ahead at first, as if she needed the landscape to steady her. Sir Benedict followed at a distance, far enough to give them a sense of privacy and close enough to satisfy propriety. When Delphine finally spoke, her voice was quiet. "Do you know what frightens me most about you?" Everard turned his head slightly toward her. "Tell me." Delphine's eyes remained forward. "That you are not dramatic," she said. "If you were dramatic, I could dismiss this as infatuation. But you are steady, and steady things last." Everard felt warmth rise in him that had nothing to do with weather. "Yes," he said softly. "They do." Delphine stopped walking. Everard stopped too, immediately, not because he was startled, but because he had learned that when Delphine paused, something important was about to be said. The path was empty nearby. The mist softened the distance, blurring the world into gray shapes and quiet. Delphine turned to face him. Her cheeks were lightly flushed from cold. Her eyes were clear and intent. Her mouth was set with the calm firmness he had come to admire. "Ask me," she said. Everard's heart did not race. It steadied, like a horse settling into a familiar pace. He removed his glove on instinct, though he did not yet reach for her, and in that small gesture there was an honesty that felt almost intimate, skin exposed, nothing hidden. "Delphine Whitcomb," Everard said, and his voice held the weight of his title without letting the title take over the words. "I love you. Not because you are convenient, not because you are simple, not because you will do what I want. I love you because you are prepared, because you are kind without being weak, because you see the world clearly and still choose goodness. I want to spend my life earning your trust, not owning your obedience." He paused, and his throat tightened, not with nerves, but with the sheer reality of speaking his truth aloud. "Will you marry me?" Delphine did not answer immediately. She looked at him for a long moment, and in that moment Everard could see the struggle in her, not between yes and no, but between desire and the fear of being diminished by desire. It was a conflict he respected. It proved how deeply she valued her own freedom. Finally, Delphine said, very quietly, "If I say yes, I will not become smaller." Everard answered at once, because this was the only promise he could make without vanity. "You will not," he said, "and if anyone tries to make you, they will have to go through me." Delphine's mouth trembled slightly, as if emotion had tried to break through her composure, and she had fought it for a heartbeat too long. Then she exhaled, slow, controlled, and said, "Yes." Everard stood very still, because he understood, in that instant, that he had been given something sacred. He did not seize her hands as if claiming a reward. He did not kiss her as if passion excused propriety. He simply reached out, slowly, and offered his bare hand. Delphine placed her gloved hand in his, and the contact was steady, no trembling, no performance. Her grip was firm enough to be real. Behind them, Sir Benedict stopped walking. Everard turned his head, met the baronet's gaze, and nodded once. Sir Benedict's expression tightened for a moment, as if emotion had surprised him, then softened into something warm and grave. "Then," Sir Benedict said, voice low, "I will begin writing to Gloucestershire immediately, because if you marry my daughter, Your Grace, you will do it properly." Everard nodded. "I will," he said, and meant it with the full force of his will. What followed was not the easy glide into happiness that naive people imagine. It was, instead, the work of making happiness durable. Everard and Delphine returned to Bath's social orbit with the quiet, unmistakable shift of engaged people, still polite, still proper, but newly anchored. Delphine did not flaunt her ring because there was no ring yet. Everard refused to present her with one until he could do it with Delphine's own choice of stone and setting, because he had learned that even a jewel could become a symbol of control if forced. Instead, the engagement was spoken of in the only way that truly silenced gossip, plainly, publicly, and without apology. The announcement was made at an evening gathering at the Assembly Rooms, the city's formal heart of dancing and social ceremony, designed precisely for public recognition and communal witnessing. Everard asked Delphine for the first dance, and the room watched as if the chandeliers themselves had grown eyes. Delphine accepted with calm dignity. Sir Benedict stood nearby with an expression that warned the room politely that any cruelty would be answered.
And you are
They danced,
my love.
not with theatrical intensity, but with a steadiness that made every observer understand something uncomfortable.
And you
This
are
was not a reckless
breathtaking,
choice.
my love.
This was a deliberate one. Lady Catherine Aldebridge watched from across the room, her smile perfectly arranged. When Everard passed near her later, she offered him congratulations in a voice sweet enough to rot teeth, and Everard returned a nod so neutral it was almost cold. He did not gloat. He did not apologize. He simply refused to pretend her disappointment mattered more than Delphine's peace. Lady Miriam, to Everard's surprise, did not attend that evening. She sent a note the next day, a single sentence, severe and honest. If you have chosen, then be consistent, and do not allow them to devour her. Everard folded the note and placed it in the same drawer where he kept deeds and decisions. He was consistent. When someone suggested, in a drawing room thick with perfumed cruelty, that Delphine had secured him, Everard looked calmly at the speaker and said, "No, I secured her. From boredom, from vanity, and from people who confuse titles with worth." The room went silent. The gossip did not end. Gossip never ends. But it grew more cautious, because Bath understood power when it was used with precision. Delphine, for her part, did not change into a different woman to suit her new position. She continued to speak to servants with respect. She continued to listen to older women who were often ignored. She continued to spend mornings with her father discussing practical matters, and Everard found himself included in those conversations with increasing frequency, not as an honored guest, but as a partner being assessed. One afternoon, late in the season, when Bath's trees had gone nearly bare and the air smelled of true coming winter, Delphine and Everard walked again in Sydney Gardens. The sky that day was clear, the sun low in the west by 4 o'clock, casting long shadows across the path and turning the remaining leaves into thin sheets of gold. The light touched Delphine's face and warmed it, and Everard thought with sudden tenderness how strange it was that a woman could look both strong and gentle at once, as if the two qualities were not opposites but companions. "You look quieter," Delphine remarked, studying him. Everard glanced at her. "Quieter?" "Yes," she said, "as if you have stopped fighting something." Everard exhaled slowly. "I have stopped fighting myself," he admitted. "I spent years believing that wanting was a weakness." Delphine's eyes softened. "Wanting can be a weakness," she said. "But it can also be a truth." Everard looked at her in the slanting light. "You have been truth since the night I met you." Delphine's cheeks colored faintly, and she gave him a look that was both pleased and mildly exasperated. "Do not become poetic," she warned. Everard's mouth curved. "I will try to restrain myself." Delphine's expression warmed, and she tucked her hand into the crook of his arm for a brief moment. So brief that no observer could call it indecent, and yet so intimate, Everard felt it like a vow. They left Bath in early November. The Whitcombes returned to Gloucestershire first, Sir Benedict insisting on travelling while the roads were still manageable. Everard remained behind 2 days longer to settle final social obligations and to make arrangements for the formal announcement to his household. When he finally departed, he did so with a mind already moving ahead. Letters to write, repairs to oversee at Ravenshollow, rooms to prepare, staff to instruct, and above all, the delicate work of ensuring that Delphine's arrival at his estate would not become an act of conquest, but an act of welcome. He visited Whitcombe Hall in the spring as promised. He arrived on a morning when the sun was clear and decisive, positioned in the east with that fresh, bright quality only early spring carried. The land looked newly awakened, hedgerows budding, fields greening, the air smelling of damp earth and faint blossoms. Delphine met him at the front steps, her hair arranged simply, her expression bright with restrained joy, and for the first time Everard allowed himself to take her hands fully and hold them a moment longer than propriety strictly required. "You came," Delphine said, as if she were still faintly astonished that men could keep promises. "I said I would," Everard replied. Delphine's eyes warmed. "Yes," she said, "and you meant it." Their wedding took place later that year, not as a spectacle designed for newspapers, but as a ceremony shaped by the values that had brought them together: dignity, steadiness, truth. Delphine walked down the aisle not like a girl being delivered, but like a woman choosing. Everard waited not like a conqueror, but like a man receiving grace he had not earned but would spend his life trying to deserve. At Raven's Hollow, winter came early, as it always did, with winds that moved like invisible hands across the moors, and snow that softened the world into silence. Delphine stood at a tall window one afternoon, with the pale sun already sinking low, the light slanting across the drawing room and marking the hour with quiet certainty. Everard watched her from the doorway, noticing the thoughtful set of her mouth, the calm stillness of her posture, and felt again the shock he had felt the first time he truly saw her. He had thought he was choosing a simple young woman, but what he had found, what he had married, was a woman formed by love into strength, educated into independence, and made gentle by security rather than need. And the great miracle of it was this: she did not weaken him. She made him more honest. Years later, when the estate weathered difficult seasons and social storms, when people tried again to press obligations onto them like weights, Everard would remember Bath, the city of stone and rules, and he would remember Delphine by the windows, choosing the edge of the room so she could keep her own shape. He would remember, too, the day he finally made his choice public and watched gossip turn cautious. Because the truth, in the end, was never that he had rescued her. The truth was that he had recognized her. And recognition, when it is real, is not a chain. It is a home. My dear listeners, if you enjoyed this story and you want more sweeping historical romances like this one, please subscribe to the channel. Leave a comment telling us your favorite moment. Hit the like button and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next chaptered love story. And if you're able and would like to support the channel, the support link is in the first pinned comment. Thank you so much for being here with us.